Welcome to our session exploring democracy, choice, voice, and reflective practices in large ensembles. As we begin, we'd like to introduce ourselves and our own personal orientations to the concept of democracy within large music ensembles.
Hello, my name is Dr. Shawn McNamara, and I currently reside in Bloomington, Illinois, United States. I teach music education courses at Illinois State University and do a little bit of trombone teaching at Illinois Wesleyan University as well. For 7 years, I taught public and private elementary and middle school, mostly in Maryland and the District of Columbia in the United States, before I began working in higher education. While I was teaching at the middle and elementary level, I began to incorporate democratic principles into my teaching through the process of repertoire choice, arranging, and composition. During my doctoral studies, I got much more interested in democracy in music education, and I've continued to explore this topic with my university students through creative activities such as improvisation, composition, and arrangement. I look forward to sharing my research with you today.
My name is Brian Weidner. I'm an assistant professor of music education at Butler University in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the United States. I've spent 12 years as a high school band director and currently serve as the director of one of our concert ensembles here at Butler University, as well as being responsible for our music education program. Democratic practices are something that I've integrated in my own programs since my early days as a high school director and are part of my pedagogy today.
Hello, my name is Wendy Matthews, and I'm an associate professor of music education at Kent State University in Ohio in the United States. Here at Kent, I teach undergraduate and graduate courses specializing in instrumental music, learning theories, and psychology of music. I also direct our Kent State Youth Winds, which is a high school honors group made up of students from Northeast Ohio. My research interests include group dynamics and large ensembles, music teacher education, and the oral histories of women brass players who are part of orchestras or military bands.
The purpose of this symposium is to explore the concept of democratic practices within large ensembles, and in the case of each of us, instrumental large ensembles. We're going to be approaching that concept of democratic practice through three very different lenses: philosophical, experiential, and pedagogical. As we go through each of our three papers, we will be taking a pause and coming back to you live. During the live discussion in between each of the papers, you'll have the opportunity to talk directly with the presenter of that paper to raise questions that you may have about that paper. At the close of the symposium, we'll be leaving about 15 minutes to discuss the further implications of this entire symposium on the large ensemble. What does it mean for us to be able to create democratic practices? What does that look like within our own situations as teachers? And importantly, how do we make it that democratic practice becomes something that permeates across our profession and can be found in ensembles, not just of those in the room right now, but those that are in the future? We'll start our presentation off with Shawn.
Musical democracy, a philosophical perspective. In the United States of America, we practice a form of representative democracy whereby citizens vote for representatives who will make many of the policy decisions that shape our everyday experiences. While the election of officials is necessary for our democracy to function as an organized system, an emphasis on this process alone obscures how democracy takes place at a local level as well as during our daily lives. Democratic interactions that happen in the midst of everyday life, as opposed to intervallically, are our most common connections to democracy. Sometimes referred to as middle democracy, these mundane and common connections take shape in the form of dialogue between individuals and groups. As a form of dialogue, deliberation in a democratic context often implies a reciprocal relationship between groups who have a desire to consciously improve their social environment. As such, the investiture of thought into the process of educating democratically in dialogical forms can help guide the incorporation of democratic principles into our communities of music learning. In my segment of this presentation, I will explore democracy in music education that focuses on the potential for democratic dialogue as musical thinking and making. As an aim of democratic education, Amy Gutman's concept of conscious social reproduction is explored and connected to music education. The process and mechanism of musical communication as democratic deliberation will be explored and then conceptualized as the musical voice. Conscious social reproduction. The music classroom as a social setting is a place where individual perspectives intersect with each other and may find resonance, confliction, or ambivalence with the larger group identities that exist in schools and other educational settings. Gutman identifies these concepts dualistically as individual freedom and civic virtue. She verbally wrestles with their dynamic interaction, explaining that while we value both as equally important, they are held in an unresolved tension. The idea of individual freedom rests on the concept of choice, the choice of what to say, when to say it, and to whom to say it to, and limited by the way in which we exert our freedom over others. Conversely, civic virtue is an abstraction of the consciously and unconsciously devised boundaries of a society, culture, or group. The concepts of individual freedom and civic virtue are both built into the U.S. Constitution and guide our everyday social interaction. Gutman also states that children cannot be educated to maximize both individual freedom and civic virtue. While maximizing education for these two concepts simultaneously is unrealistic, we can develop students' awareness and expression so that they understand that their own individual freedom and their interaction with the civic virtues that surround them. Additionally, if we can't educate to maximize both individual freedom and civic virtue, then where does that leave us as educators? It leaves educators in a position to consider our educational choices related to individual freedom and civic virtue of the music community and to consciously alter future choices in order to reproduce, not replicate, the music classroom based on these reflective considerations. Gutman's concept of conscious social reproduction, a concept in 3 parts, is the non-discrimination, non-repression, and deliberative process that she describes make up the ideals of democratic education. Non-discrimination implies that education should not discriminate students based on their social or genetic makeup, while non-repression is the rational consideration of different ways of life. Additionally, conscious social reproduction means that engaging in democratic dialogue becomes not a means-end way of thinking where once a decision is reached, that decision remains in place concretely. Rather, conscious social reproduction becomes a cyclical activity of thought and action to be engaged in regularly as an important way to relate to the people within a community. The cyclical nature of this process happens in the continual revisiting of the construction of the music project, classroom, and school environment to facilitate an experience that both helps to dissuade negative social effects while also consciously shaping the classroom in a way that is as beneficial as possible for all involved. Conscious social reproduction and the music classroom are connected through a layered definition of musical democracy. This definition is not considered from a specific political view. However, it cannot escape its connection to more liberal perspectives of democracy. Instead, it is defined by broader, more deeply ingrained ideas of democracy: voice, choice, and reflective action. These terms underlie the trifurcation of conscious social reproduction into non-discrimination, non-repression, and deliberative democracy. Choice, voice, and reflective action become themes for the process of democratic education and help to outline the mechanisms which enable this process. Most often, these mechanisms are found in various forms of verbal dialogue. However, in the music classroom, they are also found in the medium of music through a process of musical investigation, expression, and dialogue. As my conception of the democratic music making, the musical voice is explained as a process and mechanisms of education in the classroom. The musical voice, as representative of the process and mechanisms of democratic music education, is directed by an attempt to conceptualize conscious social reproduction and its corresponding themes of choice, voice, and reflective action. A student's musical voice is an embodiment of their cognitive, social, and musical skills connected to music making, as well as an investigation characterized by the aspects production and creation. I conceive of production as defined in 2 parts, bound within a chromatic and achromatic color scheme of musical choices. First, it is reflective of the student's choice to play an instrument with sonic parameters of their liking. For some students, this may be the selection of an instrument such as a synthesizer that offers a multiplicity of musical timbres to choose from at any time. For others, the selection of a mostly monophonic instrument such as a trombone may be most desirous. However, these choices are most often still bounded by the utility or need of an instrument in the music program that the student is participating in. The choice of instrument is connected to the tension between individual freedom and civic virtue described by Gutman. What instrument does a student desire to play? What expectations external to the individual, stemming from the musical culture, teacher, parents, and the music program, hold sway over the selection of musical instruments? For the students, instrument choice is a perspective that is representative of the idea of individual freedom, whereas the needs of a music program to fulfill a particular instrument, balance, or requirement is a correlate of the civic virtue of a music program. Additionally, as a part of conscious social reproduction, these questions underline the idea of non-repression, the consideration that a student's voice or choice of instrument is representative of a different worldview or way of life from that of the music teacher or the music program. As a part of democratic education, it should be important that we consider this instrument choice as a part of a student's musical voice and how that voice may be commingled into the musical voice of the music program. Second, production is described as the timbral characteristics that the students express through their instrument. For many students, this becomes a more important concept as their experience with music, command over their instrument, and aural awareness become more developed. In other words, their ability to choose becomes more acute as their musical abilities expand. My concept of production encourages the idea that sound can be thought of in a multiplicity of activity: characteristic, contextually based, and explorative. Characteristic is the gestalt of timbre that is typically associated with an instrument. Contextually based is a variation of sounds produced on an instrument from genre to genre, ensemble to ensemble, and person to person. Explorative is the idea of foraging for unfound sounds not previously associated with an instrument. Creating a conceptual frame within the chroma or color palette of production for beginners is important, but there also exists a necessity for exploration of musical tints and shades that exist or have not yet to be discovered. Allowing for the gradual awakening of sound concepts through a multiplicity of musical experiences and their contextual cognates adds possibilities to a musician's timbral palette. Dewey states that the more activity that is restricted to a few definite lines, as it is when there are rigid class lines preventing adequate interplay of experiences, the more action tends to become routine on the part of the class at a disadvantage, and capricious, aimless, and explosive on the part of the class having the material fortunate position. I think of activity as the way in which musicians are capable of producing sound on their instrument, as well as the way they think about music and its connection to timbre. If we say the trombone can only sound a particular way, then we are certainly restricting our activity to a single line of musical conception for the trombone. A single line of activity for beginners may be beneficial, but that experience of restriction needs to be emancipated over time to explore multiple possibilities, as well as explore how these lines transverse existing musical perspectives within and without of our music classroom. The second category of musical voice is creation. Creation is an exploration, examination, interrogation, and implementation of the material involved in music making. Creation leads to and encourages the development of what Woodford and Dewey describe as freedom of mind. Originating from Dewey, freedom of mind is described as a developed emancipatory mental strength that allows for individuality of thought, reason, and decision-making. As such, creation can be partitioned into two broad and interconnected aspects: interpretation and new music. Interpretation includes the freedom and capacity to devise personal meaning from existing musical practice, whether oral or notation-based, through a process of exploratory decision-making. It is the starting place for developing personal meaning stemming from a musical work, concept, or boundaries set by another. It is akin to a playground in which the elements are cemented in place, cushioned in mulch, and bound by timber. Children use the static and defined structures to play in and around, climb up and out, and imagine upon and about. Musically speaking, Interpretation is the exploration within the temporal elements and/or musical dialect of an existing piece, the timing and shapes that the notes take on. This entails the myriad ways in which a single note or group of notes can be sounded. Within interpretation lies the idea of consideration of different perspectives within music, similar to Gutmann's concept of non-repression. When exploring and examining the music of another, we engage in the consideration of that work and the musical viewpoint of another. The idea of a fixed musical space akin to a playground can become a slippery slope if it becomes solely an actual representation of the majority voice. Gould problematizes the idea that democracy includes everyone by asking, does democracy leave space for the individual without their ideas being subsumed by the ideas of the many? As Gould points out in her apt critique of the nature of democracy, for some, the idea of democracy in the classroom does not represent the ideas of individual freedom and social mobility that many people may associate with it. Reaching back to Gutmann's contrast between individual freedom and civic virtue, Gould's critique showcases an unbalanced sense of democratic education where civic virtue has come to dominate the individual freedom of some. Considering fixed musical spaces from what may be a softer perspective should be kept in balance with those that sound out the loudest. New music is the aspect of creation in which the development of new possibilities takes place and includes the manipulation of musical components as a matter of exploration and/or novel creation. While interpretation involves physical and imaginative exploration at a fixed playground, new music is more akin to a playroom where toys such as blocks, erector sets, and Play-Doh are available to be shaped and reshaped, placed, destroyed, and moved about to the content or sometimes discontent of a child. Elements such as Play-Doh or clay are easily shaped by the child's imagination, while erector sets or blocks are fixed shapes that can be arranged in infinite ways. At times, the play will be more defined with narrow parameters, such as a set of instructions to build a particular shape. At other times, the play may be freer and related to spontaneous discovery. In the music classroom, new music may at times, like I said, need to be that highly structured play that leads towards a particular musical goal. Perhaps third graders creating a composition based on the form of hot cross buns. At other times, students should be set free to experiment and piece together a musical tableau springing from their imagination in collaboration with their peers. New music perhaps provides the greatest space for music education to fulfill Dewey's definition of freedom of mind. For freedom of mind means mental power, capable of independent exercise, emancipated from the leading strings of others, not merely unhindered external operation. Here in the space of new music rests the idea of freedom to experiment, to take musical risks, to shape and reshape, to play with music in a way that encourages and challenges the act of exploration within new musical spaces. Similar to Dewey and Gutmann's democratic ideals, my conception of musical democracy maintains that dialogue is a primary ingredient in order for social change to occur. Verbal dialogue within a musical community occurs in all of the usual ways of middle democracy that lead to a more informed process of decision-making. When using language as a form of dialogue, each party generally communicates separately, responding to the other in turn. However, musical dialogue is not limited to the communication of ideas one-to-one, but can also occur in overlapping variation. If a group of individuals were communicating verbally all at once, it would be difficult to discern what each individual was saying. In music, it is common for individuals to express themselves simultaneously. Musicians engaging in democratic dialogue can play in duet, as a trio, quartet, or any variation of players that you can conceive. However, the mere act of musicians playing together does not necessarily equal democratic dialogue. As Tan points out in his transcultural theory of democracy, the act of participation as opposed to non-participation does allow for some consideration of democratic involvement in the music classroom. Tan is clear in describing that the idea of participation as democratic is fulfilled when the group is collectively acting within a unified vision of musical priorities. Conversely, participation as democratic does not necessarily reach the benchmark that Woodford sets as his idea of conversation and application to shared experiences. In the democratic music classroom, students contribute their own experiences through verbal and musical expression, while also helping to shape the musical community in collaboration with the voices of others. Woodford's conception of conversation becomes the act of musical dialogue, while the application to shared experiences is linked to the construction of a musical community. The musical voice, as a part of the process and mechanism of democratic dialogue, can help teachers conceptualize these ideas for the music classroom. As a part of conscious social reproduction, democratic dialogue and deliberation help to fulfill the aim of democratic education. These concepts help teachers to explore the personal and community boundaries and limitations so that a better society can be reproduced in the future. Democracy gives our music students an opportunity to develop, explore, and express their ideas in a social environment so that they can have a greater capacity to intentionally alter the musical world for the betterment of themselves and other members of their community. Thank you.
In order to create meaningful change, we have to disrupt the experiences our students have already had at some point. The focus of this study was on that process of introducing democratic practices to collegiate students for the first time. Throughout this paper, I'll be defining democratic practices around these three large areas. The idea of decentralized agency is that all participants have a voice and a responsibility to share that voice. The idea behind critical decision making is that choices have to be made and have to be made with justification and purpose, not just haphazardly. And finally, that collaborative rehearsing is the goal of our music making. Through processes of agency and decision making, everyone in the room has a role to play in shaping the way that the rehearsal is carried out. Now, democratic practice is by no means a new conversation in music education, and previous conversations have really emphasized the problems with this director-centric model and the necessity for students to engage in critical decision-making as part of their music making. Previous work that has looked at democratic practices in the band classroom have really focused on this issue of student agency. Who has voice, who has choice to be able to share? And the foundation of this study is really built on this idea that disruption is the first step in reform. That first we disrupt existing systems, existing experiences, and then we replace them through sustained experiences with alternatives to our traditions. One way in which we can create this sort of disruption is through student-led rehearsals of various sorts and types, which we'll investigate a little further throughout this paper. So the guiding questions of this study that focused on a concert ensemble that was for the first time using democratic practices is first, how do students actually experience democratic practice within their ensemble rehearsal? And second, how do those skills for democratic practice evolve as students are exposed for a more extended, sustained period of time within that ensemble space? The study used a critical case study of the Butler University Symphonic Band over the course of 3 semesters leading up to the spring of 2020 when COVID brought this to an end. There were video recordings of all of our rehearsals and participant interviews, and in total about a quarter of the students participated in these. I also had 4 students who were serving as assistants, collecting some of those interviews and providing memos of their own experiences within the classroom as they experienced, again, a variety of different democratic practices. In terms of the analysis of this, all the interviews and memos utilized in vivo process coding, and then I used a rehearsal frame analysis of those rehearsal videos to understand the sorts of activities that students were engaging in, as well as the frequency with which change was made in those spaces. Now, when we're talking about democratic practice within this classroom, that can encompass many different sorts of experiences, ranging from, on the left, completely teacher-led experiences to, on the right, completely student-led experiences. For nearly all the students in this program, they came from very director-centric programs that really limited student voice, choice, and agency to concepts of student leadership. So for most of the students, these were new experiences. This started with Socratic questioning, simply asking students to engage with music started from the director out to the students, and then using their feedback to address how we move forward. Over time, we moved to a communal goal setting process that set goals not just for individual rehearsals, but entire concert cycles. What is it that we're looking to achieve as an ensemble? What are the needs that we have as an ensemble that we want to be able to accomplish? Third, we looked at shared rehearsal planning. We did this through a variety of means, both in the classroom, using the Pop-In app to allow students to provide guidance in what we should be rehearsing, and then also through a Google Doc that allowed the students to be able to provide information of what we should do in upcoming rehearsals. And finally, we concluded with directorless ensembles, during which I completely stepped away from the podium and allowed the students to direct all the aspects of this. Our next paper by Wendy Matthews is going to explore this a little more in detail. So for the sake of time, I won't dwell too much on the nitty-gritty details of what that looked like. I'd like to share with you what the end result, or maybe a midpoint result of this looked like. This is one of our rehearsals with the symphonic band, and they are doing conductorless ensemble work at this time.
Did the opposite, we sped up. Again? Same thing. Worth noting there are two people on the clarinet with the melody. We're playing as loud as we can, but there's two of us. So beginning to 33, focusing on balance.
So the students had a variety of different responses to their experiences with democratic practices. As for many of them, this was the first time they had experienced the request of making choices themselves. For many of them, there was a sense of empowerment from this. There was a recognition that each person had a right and an expectation to act within the classroom, and that they had to make decisions because no one else was going to do so. Similarly, several of the students talked about the need to make sure that all voices were heard, and their role not just of providing some of those voices when they were absent, but also seeking out the voices of students who were otherwise muted in the rehearsal. This led to a sense of individual responsibility that for many of the students, they didn't necessarily feel that they had in their previous ensembles. There was an increased awareness that if I don't play my part correctly, it will impact everyone else. And importantly, this peer pressure of I'll let everyone else down if I don't act. And several of the students talked about the fact that that peer pressure was different from what it was when it was the director on the podium and they would just disappoint that director. Similarly, there was this sense that there was a responsibility to others to make sure that others had the support they needed. One of the things that happened very quickly within these rehearsal settings was watching students no longer sit quietly when they weren't playing, but rather turning the student to their left and the right to ask how they could support them, to ask for support themselves, and making sure that everyone was on board with the big concept that was being addressed by the entire group. I think one of the biggest benefits that came out of this was the sense of greater creativity. And this ran underneath many of the student statements. It was actually difficult to capture in a single quotation because they kept coming back to that idea over and over again. They emphasized that because they were the ones making the choices and they were the responsible parties, not the director, that they were discovering that they themselves could be creative. And not only that they could be creative, but they had a responsibility to be. What was particularly notable was when we reverted to more director-centric practices, this creativity remained as students continued to bring their own interpretations in and ask during class and outside of class how their creativity could be applied more readily to the music. Now, it's important to note that not all the students came in and said, this is a great experience. One point that particularly came up, even from those who really enjoyed democratic practices, was that the rehearsal progresses much more slowly. Because there's a sense of consensus building, because there's a sense that there are decisions to be made that aren't just coming from a single statement from the director on the podium, students really felt that the pace of the rehearsal slowed down. It was oftentimes followed up with that they had an increased understanding of what was happening, but that the trade-off that understanding was a loss of time. Importantly, there are also students who adamantly hated this experience. This first quote was actually from one of the students who was one of the most vocal ones in the classroom. She was one who would take the step forward in leading. She'd be one that oftentimes had the controversial response. And this created a lot of social tension for her, not only in the classroom, but outside the classroom as well. Especially for the non-music majors in the ensemble, which is about a third of the students. Some of them really responded that they didn't like this much because band was the spot that they came to have fun, to enjoy what they were doing, to shut down from thinking about the other things they had in the day. And that by doing this, as the student mentioned, they had to use their brain power. And that was something that they didn't sign up for band to do. So you can see that there's a range of different sorts of responses, but these varied as we went through stages of development in this. I've identified 3 large stages of development that the ensemble went through over the course of really the first 2 concert cycles that we did this, so over the first fall. By the end of that fall, we found that we kind of fell into this familiar groove of that 3rd stage. So the first stage was, not surprisingly, one that students were really uncertain about what was going on. These were new experiences for them. Not surprisingly, the format, especially when we went to conductorless ensemble models, was one that was a lot about large run-throughs and large section sort of work. The students didn't really bring much analysis to the table, but rather talked about, I like this, I don't like this. And it oftentimes had relatively little justification for those opinions. It was whatever they were thinking at the moment, and they kind of tried to run with that and often couldn't support it very well. There was also a sense that there wasn't a clear leadership or responsibility that anyone in the student group had. We often had lots of talking, but there was very limited listening to what was going on. Students had lots of ideas, but not necessarily solutions on how to move forward. There was a real willingness to complain, but a really limited ability to strategize on what comes next. Students had started to grasp the idea that they had agency, but not that critical decision-making requires reason, argument, and justification. As we moved into the second stage, and this was probably by the 2nd or 3rd rehearsal, we started to see students coming around to the fact that democratic practices were sticking around and that their job, if they were going to have effective rehearsals, was to make decisions and be able to justify them and be able to think about how we move forward. So when it turned time to start doing rehearsal, we started, rather than doing large run-throughs, running multiple phrase sections. So we'd take an entire theme and play through it, and oftentimes get stuck in that single theme, continuing to work on that one idea for a fairly extended period of time. We found, though, that we started to see individuals really step forward as leaders and as the decision makers for the group. This certainly wasn't a situation where everyone in the room was actively participating, or at least willingly, but we did see that students started to realize that they were the ones that had agency, they were the ones that needed to make decisions, and in the shared rehearsal space, they were going to help move things forward. Admittedly, there was a fair amount of pushback, and we heard that from one of the students earlier who said, I voiced my opinions and I get frustration back from it. It was during this stage that she shared those words with me. When we look at the strategies the students are using, at this stage, we're mostly working with black and white sorts of issues. Are we playing the correct notes and rhythms? Are we missing entrances? We had some discussion about dynamics and phrasing, but they're all in very concrete terms. It says we should play forte. It says we should decrescendo. But we start seeing students be able to talk about explicitly what they hear and how they're going to correct it. Importantly, we start seeing some sense of consensus building. Now, importantly, this is oftentimes among those 6 to 8 leaders of the group, and it has some pushback, some disconnect, and some resentment from others, but we start being able to formulate ways in which to move forward. And it's out of that frustration that stage 3 really takes place. At one point, the students came up and said, can we have a rehearsal that is just about laying out our ground rules? And we took that rehearsal to establish the processes and the responsibilities that were going to allow us to meaningfully rehearse. One of the important things that they identified was that we needed to focus on details. So we went from these very large rehearsals of run-throughs, or at least main themes, to very short rehearsal frames. Let's address something for a measure, talk about it, then play, with a lot of whole part whole sort of rehearsal, so that students are going from context to specifics back to context again. When we look at the strategies the students are using, we see that it's much more nuanced. The students are focusing on how they need to make the music, what the specific problem is, and what the tool is that they're going to need to be able to do it. Importantly, there are oftentimes multiple small groups going on at the same time. So while the clarinets and flutes are working on one idea, the low brass and low reeds are working on a different idea at the back of the room simultaneously. At this time, they also developed some really specific rules. They have to be playing every 90 seconds. So once 90 seconds hits, we play again. No one can talk in 2 consecutive rehearsal frames. There's a clear rehearsal plan set before rehearsal via Google Docs so everyone knows what we're doing as we come into class. We start to see that there are various jobs that arise: the timekeeper, the consensus gatherer, a lead voice for each section, and a document creator who each play a role in those rules that they've created for themselves. And importantly, there's a hierarchy that's built so that all voices have a chance to come in. In this case, it's the high woodwinds, high brass, mid voices, low voices, and percussion, so that even those who are quiet still have a chance to influence what goes on in the classroom. So when we look at this moving forward, there's some important implications that come into play if we're going to bring democratic practice in. First of all, we can't just expect students to know how to do this because they likely haven't had those experiences prior to this. These initial days in doing democratic practice are extensively messy. This is a process that has lots of false starts, and there's a value for the students to know that they don't have a safety net, but also that the risks aren't real high. One of the things that the teacher needs to do in this space is provide students support in thinking about how to critically think. What does it take to collaborate? How do we problem solve? What does it take to do consensus building? What sorts of rules might we want to have for ourselves? And importantly, this entire process takes time. It took about 4 rehearsals before we got something that we would call an effective rehearsal, and it's important for us to realize that. As we continue forward, it's going to be important to see, does this have lasting value, not just in these democratically aligned ensembles, but what happens when these students step in to ensembles that don't have that alignment? And I'd like to leave that as a starting question for our discussion now to follow. All right, was this working the entire time? Thank goodness, because I didn't check before I started.
Welcome to my presentation entitled Intergroup Beliefs in Conductorless Ensembles. My name is Wendy Matthews, and I'm an associate professor at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, in the United States. This presentation is part of a symposium for the 35th World Conference for the International Society for Music Education, titled Exploring Democracy, Choice, Voice, and Reflective Practice in Large Ensembles. My paper is the 3rd in the symposium. Participation in large musical ensembles encompasses many challenges and obstacles that demand sustained cooperative effort, which is influenced by interpersonal and situational factors. The purpose of this study is to investigate intergroup beliefs regarding participation in the conductorless rehearsal method by first examining the constructs of self-efficacy, which is personal beliefs regarding one's capabilities to perform successfully, and two, collective efficacy, an indicator of the group's judgment of their combined capabilities to accomplish a task. The second purpose of this study is to investigate skills ensemble members report developing during participation. The participants include musicians from an intact wind ensemble at a university in the United States. Participants were queried during 3 phases of the research project: at the beginning, middle, and end of an 8-week rehearsal cycle, where they rehearsed and performed conductorless for one musical composition. The process of conductorless rehearsal is peer-directed learning. Peer-directed learning is a way of folding the students into the rehearsal process. Here, students are forced to listen differently and to think about the music in a new way, providing potential opportunities for students to discover new skills. Students must learn who to evaluate and then communicate their ideas to others in ways that builds trust, empathy, and meaningful connections. These connections can make the actual performing of the music a more meaningful experience, creating a greater sense of personal responsibility and value to the ensemble. Research has shown peer-directed learning, such as conductorless ensembles, provides many opportunities for students of any level to discover new skills, foster creativity, and develop critical thinking and problem-solving skills as they identify their challenges. Davis, 2010, found the inclusion of informal learning in a beginning ensemble can set the stage for awareness and meaningful connections within the ensemble. Similarly, McPherson and Welch, 2018, found that simply providing time for students to perform music they have discovered how to play on their own can augment social awareness and foster a sense of community. Allowing opportunities for choice is important to creativity. If students have practice with problem finding and define at least some portion of their own challenges, motivation and creativity can be enhanced. Kudasakov in 2008 found peer-directed learning in ensembles fosters trust for others, which enables students to cultivate open communication, civility, the ability to listen and follow colleagues, willingness to be accountable, consideration of alternative ideas, willingness to take artistic risks, and the creation welcoming environment for all. Peer-directed learning can foster creativity. Why is it important to talk about creativity and to create scenarios in our ensembles that empower students to be creative? Creativity is an important component of problem solving. It is a way to build on strengths instead of remediating weaknesses. It is vital to promote healthy psychological functions, coping, and emotional growth. Creativity is oftentimes referred to as novelty, something that can be viewed as new, original. And its value comes in the appropriateness of the new ideas to the person or situation. If we help students to believe today is a starting point, and with hard work and dedication that their abilities will grow, then we help them develop a growth mindset. This approach empowers students to improve, catch up, or even surpass their own expectations. Growth mindset fuels students' creativity as they begin to understand that value and enjoying learning is important. Peer-directed learning can provide opportunities to take on new challenges, to learn from mistakes, accept feedback from others, develop musical practice skills, and to learn perseverance. Many attribute the origins of the conductorless process to the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, which is an orchestra with no conductor. The group was founded in 1972 by cellist Julian Pfeiffer and a small group of like-minded musicians. Their goal was to bring the chamber music ideals of democracy, personal involvement, and mutual respect into the large orchestral setting. Many wind band educators believe that this conductorless experience engages musicians in utilizing chamber music skills within the large ensemble setting, resulting in improved individual and group musicianship. Benefits of this experience address concerns regarding the need for democratic music making in traditional ensembles. For this study, 41 instrumentalists from a wind ensemble in the United States participated. 68% were undergraduates and 32% graduates. 54% were male and 44% female. The ensemble was predominantly white at 92%. It represented music majors, 37% in performance, 37% in education. 12% of the participants were non-music majors or earning a Bachelor's of Arts, and the others were studying conducting, ethnomusicology, history, or music theory at the graduate level. For this study, the students were utilizing a composition entitled My Jesus, Oh What Anguish by Johann Sebastian Bach, arranged by Alfred Reed. The students received scores, score study guidelines, and were split into small study groups approximately 6 weeks before the first rehearsal. Students had 8 rehearsals to prepare the performance. The students created a shared Google document to develop their rehearsal plans prior to each rehearsal. Then, each rehearsal was video recorded and shared online. Participants responded during 3 points in the rehearsal cycle: at the beginning, called time 1, the middle, time 2, and the last rehearsal before the final performance, time 3. At each rehearsal, participants were asked to rate their self-efficacy and collective efficacy with 1 item each on a Likert scale of 0, not confident at all, to 10, completely confident. Additionally, there were 9 open-ended questions looking at students' beliefs regarding the success of the rehearsal and how they contributed musically, if they guided the decision-making, and if they believed the development of any musical, leadership, ensemble, or collaborative skills developed while engaging in this process. The open-ended questions included: why do you think your ensemble was successful or not successful in the rehearsal? Why or why not? 2, were you successful or not successful in today's rehearsal? Why or why not? 3, did you contribute in any musical ways to today's rehearsal? Why or why not? If you did, please describe. Did you contribute to today's decision making? Why or why not? If you did, please describe. Number 5, what ways did you and or the ensemble make decisions to express the composer's intent? 6, did you develop any individual musical skills in today's rehearsal? If so, describe how and why you used these skills. Question 7, did you develop any leadership skills in today's rehearsals? If so, describe how and why you used these skills. 8, did you develop any ensemble skills used today in today's rehearsal? If so, describe how and why you used these skills. Number 9, did you develop any collaborative skills such as teamwork or communication in today's rehearsal? If so, describe how and why you use these skills. Now, I would like to discuss the results. As you can see in this slide, with regard to self-efficacy, pairwise comparisons indicate significant differences between time 1 and time 3, but no significant differences between time 1 and time 2, suggesting that their beliefs and their abilities to participate in the conductorless process rose as they got more comfortable with the process. Similarly, for collective efficacy, pairwise comparisons indicate significant differences between time 1 and time 3, but no significant differences between time 1 and time 2, also suggesting a stronger belief in the capabilities of the full group to work through this conductorless process. Within each of the open-ended questions, the number of positive comments and negative comments were tallied and compared. As you can see, during the first rehearsals, the number of negative and positive comments were about equal. Then, as the process continued, there were more positive comments regarding the ensemble's success. Regarding the students' beliefs on their success, the positive comments always outweighed the negative comments. One of the implications of this is that musicians entered the process with high self-efficacy regarding their musical skills. As these were predominantly college students, this seemed reasonable for them to have strong beliefs in their abilities. When asked, did you contribute to today's decision-making, students had more negative comments than positive. This was consistent throughout the process. They expressed being uncomfortable leading or making decisions. As this was a new process for most of them, many felt they didn't have the skills to offer suggestions and were concerned their peers would not value their input. When asked, did you develop any individual music skills in today's rehearsal? Most didn't respond positively. Many indicated that they developed their individual skills by themselves in a practice room or in a private lesson. A few commented on developing better ensemble-type skills during this process. When asked, did you develop any leadership skills in today's rehearsal? There were still predominantly negative comments, including no growth or no change. However, there are some insightful comments, including emphasizing that you can also lead by example and knowing when to follow others is important. One student commented, sometimes being a good leader means knowing when to follow someone else's lead. With regard to developing ensemble skills through this process, the comments were split rather evenly, with more positive comments in time 3. The positive comments, many centered around listening and interpretation. One student commented, I feel that I developed my skills to really listen to the rest of the ensemble and to know where my dynamics should fit in with how others are playing. When asked, did you develop any collaborative skills, such as teamwork or communication, in today's rehearsal? The comments were predominantly negative. However, one student gave an insightful comment. I do not contribute much because I don't play much, and I'm doubtful that my voice will be heard. I think there's potential for collaboration to take place in this process, but I think it's a delicate combination of repertoire selection and group dynamics that affect this. In conclusion, throughout the process, student self-efficacy and collective efficacy grew. However, when asked about their beliefs regarding the success of the rehearsal, how they contributed musically, if they guided decision-making, or if they believed the development of any musical, leadership, ensemble, or collaborative skills developed while engaging the process, their answers were predominantly negative. The comments indicated that they were not sure how to act during the process and felt underprepared to participate. For future studies, it would be important to include more training in the conductorless process, and then to study groups that engage in this process regularly. Here are some suggestions for building and maintaining a conductorless ensemble by Katzman 2018. Make sure you empower students to make decisions by fostering an environment of openness and trust. Encourage all students to take personal responsibility for learning the material. Clearly specify the role of each member, especially the core, the front row, the middle row, and the back row. Be sure to share leadership positions by rotating seats. Encourage students to collaborate within their section and across sections during rehearsal. Guide students to be an active listener and communicate in a thoughtful and candid manner. And finally, aid students in building consensus through discussion, experimentation of ideas, and reflection. The goal of this study was to hear the voices involved in the process of conductorless ensembles. It is our hope that this process will help students become creative thinkers. In this way, they'll be comfortable in disagreeing with others and trying new and novel solutions. They'll be able to combine knowledge from previous disparate fields. They'll be able to persevere through difficult problems and dry spells. And finally, they'll be able to step away from an effort and return later with a fresh perspective. Thank you for listening to my presentation regarding interbeliefs of students engaged in the conductorless process. My colleagues and I look forward to your comments and discussion about our studies. We also look forward to hearing from you how you have or are going to use this process in your future ensembles. Thank you.